At 6:15 on the morning of June 5, 1944, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel walked through the courtyard with a measured stride, carrying a carefully wrapped gift for his wife, unaware that history was tightening around him like a closing fist. He had spent months reinforcing the Atlantic Wall, laying mines and emplacing obstacles across every stretch of vulnerable shoreline in northern France. Now, as he departed for Herlingen to celebrate his wife's birthday, he believed poor weather and scattered intelligence granted Germany several more days of uneasy calm. The morning air carried a heavy scent of rain, promising tempests that German meteorologists insisted would ground any Allied invasion force. Rommel trusted their assessments reluctantly, however, understanding that deception surrounded every forecast, every intercepted report, and every interpretation of enemy intentions. Yet his instincts whispered of danger, urging continued vigilance despite the apparent storms drifting across the channel. He wrestled with those doubts quietly, knowing that fatigue and prolonged tension had already frayed the nerves of commanders stretched thin along the immense defensive line. His staff watched him depart with strained expressions, sensing that his absence created a dangerous vacuum during the war's most uncertain hours. Messages crackled through distant outposts, reporting minor Allied movements that seemed routine, yet carried the unsettling rhythm of impending escalation. The roads leading from the chateau glistened with fresh moisture, reflecting the turbulent sky that mirrored the anxiety-gripping German command. Rommel's driver maneuvered cautiously along winding paths, allowing the field marshal a final contemplative glance toward the sprawling valley where his decisions had shaped months of preparation. He carried deep frustration over limited armored reserves, which remained locked under strict authorization protocols imposed by higher command. This bureaucratic entanglement had undermined his plans repeatedly, forcing him to rely on static defenses rather than mobile forces capable of repelling an invasion decisively. As the car advanced, he considered the gulf between his strategic understanding and the rigid doctrines favored by Berlin's senior leadership. Their reluctance to decentralize authority risked turning any rapid Allied thrust into an irreversible breakthrough, especially if the enemy achieved concentrated momentum. Passing through small French villages, Rommel noted shuttered windows and empty streets, reminders of an occupied land awaiting liberation or deeper turmoil. He understood that fear and resentment simmered beneath the surface, shaping the environment in ways that complicated Germany's defensive posture significantly. Further along the route, distant thunder rolled across the horizon, masking the faint hum of Allied aircraft that already probed inland skies. These early flights went unrecognized by many German observers who attributed them to weather anomalies rather than coordinated reconnaissance. Rommel reviewed his schedule silently, convinced that returning the next day would allow him to resume oversight before any dramatic developments unfolded. This belief, grounded in fragmented intelligence and deceptive calm, became one of the most consequential misjudgments of his military career. By the time he reached the countryside's open fields, the weight of the Atlantic Wall's responsibilities faded briefly, replaced by thoughts of home and fleeting normalcy. Yet the storm gathering above him signaled more than weather, marking the final quiet before the world changed irrevocably. The cold Channel wind pressed against the fortified shoreline, carrying distant echoes of unseen engines that worried every German observer. Rommel inspected each sector carefully, urging exhausted soldiers to place every stake precisely because he believed the invasion would arrive before their preparations finished. Rows of Belgian gates stretched across damp sand, their steel frames anchoring Rommel's desperate conviction that time worked relentlessly against his scattered defenses. Engineers hammered new obstacles urgently, their hands trembling from fatigue as officers measured distances obsessively to ensure maximum disruption when Allied landing craft finally approached. Behind the dunes, minefields expanded outward steadily, forming a lethal geometry Rommel hoped would fracture any assault before infantry established momentum. Teams buried explosives continuously under shifting sediment, marking positions on rough maps because the relentless tide often distorted their careful calculations. Rommel walked between wooden stakes tipped with mines, studying overlapping arcs he demanded be tightened further before dusk slowed their progress. He reminded commanders that every meter mattered critically, insisting their incomplete barriers must still appear impenetrable when reconnaissance planes photographed the coastline. At a reinforced bunker overlooking Vierville, veteran gunners adjusted range tables nervously, Understanding Rommel feared overwhelming firepower might still sweep aside their strongest emplacements. Ammunition stocks were arranged meticulously around them, reflecting the urgency gripping units confronting a threat they could only estimate. Along narrow access roads, supply vehicles pushed forward constantly, delivering steel rails, demolition charges, and concertina wire demanded for each unfinished defensive pocket. Drivers sensed mounting tension through whispered conversations, recognizing efforts to strengthen the Atlantic Wall accelerated beyond sustainable pace. At Point du Hoc, labor crews hauled concrete endlessly, shaping casemates intended to survive naval bombardment, expected to precede any full-scale invasion. Their tools scraped rhythmically against molds, echoing across cliffs Rommel believed represented a pivotal hinge controlling approaches toward deeper French territory. Local French civilians watched construction warily, their forced contributions deepening resentment as German officers expanded fortified zones aggressively. Rommel instructed administrators to complete tasks efficiently because he believed Allied planners counted on exploiting structural weaknesses created by rushed labor. Further east near Calais, signals officers monitored encrypted transmissions, uncertain whether growing Allied radio traffic indicated real preparations or deliberate deception. Rommel studied these reports nightly, convinced strategic misdirection concealed an imminent assault targeting his vulnerable Norman coastline instead. As twilight settled across the channel, patrols inspected beach obstacles repeatedly, repositioning driftwood markers, signaling submerged hazards shifting with tides. Their lanterns flickered against iron shadows, revealing an unfinished labyrinth Rommel still hoped might delay any invasion long enough for reinforcements. By midnight, the Atlantic Wall stretched outward like a fractured shield, immense yet clearly incomplete, reflecting Rommel's determination to resist an approaching storm he anticipated keenly. Soldiers sensed the coastline's trembling uncertainty, recognizing their hurried labor carried consequences destined to unfold violently within mere hours. The pre-dawn horizon remained obscured by violent Atlantic turbulence, forcing German meteorologists to rely on fragmented barometric readings that produced conflicting projections, creating uncertainty Rommel interpreted as temporary disruption rather than a decisive atmospheric shift capable of concealing an imminent, Allied assault he still believed impossible during worsening storms. Inside coastal command posts, officers studied churning pressure charts, noting falling readings across scattered stations, yet senior planners insisted approaching instability would intensify further, convincing themselves no large fleet could risk hazardous seas while gale-force winds continued hammering exposed waters relentlessly along the vulnerable Norman coastline. Weather units transmitted cautious summaries toward higher headquarters, but their signals merged with routine operational chatter, allowing vital warnings to appear less urgent than intended, reinforcing a belief that multiple days of unfavorable conditions still separated German defenses from the possibility of an Allied landing. In Paris, meteorological specialists struggled to interpret sparse maritime observations, relying heavily on inland data unsuited for predicting channel volatility, causing analysts to underestimate brief atmospheric windows that Allied forecasters correctly identified, enabling them to greenlight a massive invasion when German intelligence least expected meaningful movement. Commanders at 7th Army headquarters accepted these incomplete forecasts without pressing for additional verification, partly because senior leadership remained convinced strategic deception indicated a later assault near Calais, allowing deteriorating weather to appear supportive of long-held assumptions rather than challenging them. Staff officers recorded storm conditions routinely, believing chaotic winds possessed strategic advantages by limiting enemy reconnaissance, while overlooking the possibility that Allied planners might exploit momentary lulls invisible to German instruments, revealing a fatal overconfidence shaping every defensive calculation. Along the coast, junior meteorologists expressed quiet doubts after noticing subtle pressure rises inconsistent with predicted worsening storms. Yet their analyses failed to alter standing assessments dominated by rigid expectations rather than flexible interpretations, responsive to shifting atmospheric dynamics. Rommel's absence compounded these misjudgments, as his emphasis on unpredictability might have prompted reconsideration. But senior officers relied heavily on standardized procedures that discounted sudden weather reversals historically capable of transforming operational landscapes rapidly across northern European coastlines. Encrypted reports from naval stations detailing improving visibility arrived too late for meaningful revision, since higher headquarters dismissed isolated observations as anomalies rather than indicators of stabilizing conditions forming briefly across crucial sea corridors essential for amphibious operations. The Luftwaffe's grounded reconnaissance further distorted perception, preventing updated aerial surveys that might have revealed increasing Allied preparations concealed beneath storm cover, leaving German planners effectively blind while trusting forecasts that failed to capture evolving environmental patterns accurately. By evening, staff convinced themselves severe turbulence rendered any invasion impractical, reinforcing widespread complacency fueled by earlier assumptions, ensuring defenses remained unprepared when the weather unexpectedly calmed, creating the precise opportunity Eisenhower required for launching the largest amphibious assault in history. Thus, misread forecasts, scattered observations, and rigid expectations combined into a catastrophic misjudgment, allowing the German command to dismiss signs of rapid atmospheric change, ultimately ensuring they faced the approaching Allied armada with inadequate readiness during the final hours before the decisive landing. Darkness settled over the Norman countryside as scattered German sentries first detected distant engine tremors, creating faint vibrations drifting across damp fields. Yet their initial reports traveled slowly through fragmented communication chains, allowing crucial early warnings to fade beneath routine background noise dominating nighttime operations along the occupied French coastline. Moments later, the night sky erupted with the thunder of incoming transport aircraft, releasing waves of Allied paratroopers whose silhouettes drifted through erratic winds, scattering formations across hedgerows, marshes, and fortified junctions, spreading confusion that German observers struggled to interpret through disoriented glimpses, illuminated intermittently by anti-aircraft fire. At several outposts, startled defenders attempted to sound alarms, but regional headquarters hesitated to classify these sightings as the beginning of a major assault, partly because prevailing expectations predicted landings far from Normandy, encouraging officers to categorize unfolding events as isolated raids rather than coordinated invasion components. Gliders descended silently behind enemy lines, landing roughly across orchards and flooded meadows, smashing through fences while delivering airborne troops tasked with capturing bridges, crossroads, and communication hubs. Yet German units receiving scattered distress signals misjudged these crashes as accidental overflights caused by worsening weather conditions. Local commanders attempted to mobilize reserves, but authorization delays created dangerous stagnation, preventing timely counterattacks that might have disrupted airborne objectives, particularly at strategic points where lightly equipped German battalions awaited orders that never arrived during the most critical opening minutes. Inside coastal bunkers, officers debated conflicting messages arriving from outlying sectors, struggling to separate genuine emergencies from exaggerated accounts often produced during nighttime patrols, causing further hesitation that allowed Allied paratroopers to consolidate scattered groups into effective fighting formations. Villagers across the region awoke to unfamiliar sounds of gliders skidding through fields, hearing shouted commands from both armies echoing across darkened terrain, while German patrols carefully approached suspected landing zones without understanding the scale of the airborne operation rapidly developing around them. At several command posts, telephone operators attempted to relay urgent updates, but overloaded lines caused intermittent failures, leaving many districts isolated, confused, and vulnerable, with junior leaders forced to rely on partial information that obscured accurate assessments of Allied intentions. In the marshlands near the Murderate River, clusters of German troops engaged isolated paratrooper groups, believing they faced small reconnaissance detachments rather than elements of a massive airborne network, missing opportunities to counter significant movements, shaping the battle's early narrative. Senior officers remained reluctant to wake higher headquarters, fearing reprimands for false alarms, a hesitation rooted in strict peacetime-style discipline that clashed disastrously with the fluid, unpredictable nature of nighttime airborne warfare rapidly unfolding across Normandy. As reports multiplied, uncertainty intensified, creating a fog of indecision that paralyzed German responses, preventing rapid concentration of defensive strength at vulnerable sectors, while airborne units seized vital corridors essential for the approaching seaborne invasion, moving steadily through the channel under gradually improving skies. By dawn, the fragmented chaos of the night revealed its strategic magnitude. showing how unanswered alarms, delayed authorizations, and misinterpreted signals enabled Allied forces to secure footholds inland, ultimately weakening the German ability to repel the massive assault preparing to strike the beaches. Throughout the early morning hours, reports cascading from Normandy revealed widespread airborne engagements, yet Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt remained constrained by a rigid command structure that denied him operational freedom, forcing him to wait for authorization from Berlin before releasing armored divisions, positioned for rapid counterattacks essential to halting coastal breakthroughs. In Germany, Wilhelm Keitel received fragmented updates that failed to convey the urgency developing along the Atlantic Wall, prompting him to underestimate the scale of the assault, thereby preserving bureaucratic procedures that prevented swift deployment of panzer units whose timely movement might have disrupted Allied footholds before they solidified. The German High Command relied heavily on Adolf Hitler's direct approval for any significant armored movement, a system designed for political control rather than battlefield efficiency, causing catastrophic delays as headquarters attempted repeatedly to contact the Führer, who remained unreachable during the critical early hours. Rundstedt assessed mounting evidence with growing frustration, understanding that rapid response represented the only chance to counter airborne penetrations. Yet his pleas for immediate action met procedural resistance, illustrating how doctrinal inflexibility crippled German adaptability on a morning defined by unprecedented operational chaos. As the crisis deepened, staff officers debated conflicting intelligence, struggling to determine whether Normandy represented the primary invasion or a diversion preceding expected landings elsewhere, a hesitation that stalled movement of reserve divisions stationed inland to react against whichever sector required decisive intervention. Panzerlehr Division, one of Germany's most formidable armored formations, remained immobilized by convoluted clearance requirements, its tanks idling in assembly areas while Allied forces secured critical junctions, demonstrating how systemic delays squandered opportunities to challenge advancing airborne brigades. Keitel's reliance on optimistic assessments from subordinate officers reinforced dangerous assumptions, encouraging continued belief that weather conditions made large-scale landings improbable, which further justified postponing armored deployment until unmistakable signs appeared, by which time strategic momentum had shifted irreversibly toward Allied control. Rundstedt's staff recognized the deteriorating situation, yet their capacity to implement independent action remained non-existent, reflecting institutional paralysis created by years of centralized decision-making that suppressed initiative, particularly among leaders fearful of contradicting established doctrines or offending superiors during critical moments. When communication finally reached Hitler, the resulting directives arrived too late to generate meaningful counterpressure, compelling armored divisions to maneuver along congested roads already compromised by Allied air superiority, reducing their effectiveness before reaching contested sectors. During this sluggish redeployment, Allied units expanded their lodgements, fortifying positions that demanded increasingly larger German responses, thereby compounding operational disadvantages created by earlier hesitation, illustrating how delay transformed a manageable threat into a rapidly escalating strategic disaster. German commanders attempted localized counterattacks, but the absence of coordinated armor support limited their impact, allowing enemy forces to exploit terrain, disrupt supply lines, and consolidate gains that should have been contested aggressively before armored reinforcements became trapped within bureaucratic stagnation. By midday, the consequences of command paralysis became unmistakable, revealing how Rundstedt's insights, Keitel's hesitations, and Hitler's unavailability created a fatal vacuum in decision-making, ultimately preventing the armored reserves from delivering the decisive blow that German doctrine demanded during the invasion's most vulnerable opening hours. At Utah Beach, strong currents pushed the first assault wave south of its intended zone, yet this displacement unexpectedly placed American troops opposite weaker German positions whose machine gun nests lacked overlapping fields of fire. Commanders quickly exploited the favorable terrain, directing landing teams inland with confidence, despite disorganized coastal resistance. German units defending Utah suffered from fragmented communication, relying on delayed telephone reports that failed to convey accurate troop movements, weakening regional coordination. As American infantry pressed forward, small garrisons unable to synchronize their fires collapsed under steady advances supported by armor landing earlier than anticipated. Artillery observers along Utah's dunes struggled to identify targets through drifting smoke, causing German fire missions to fall inconsistently across empty sand and shallow marshland. These misplaced barrages allowed American engineers to open additional landing lanes, rapidly increasing the tempo of incoming forces despite persistent sporadic resistance. Omaha Beach presented an entirely different challenge, with steep bluffs and fortified positions delivering relentless fire against congested American units pinned along the waterline. Machine gun crews on elevated strongpoints executed disciplined patterns, creating deadly zones that initially prevented coordinated infantry movement and forced commanders to improvise survival-focused tactics. German defenders at Omaha included experienced soldiers capable of maintaining fire discipline even without consistent radio support, enabling early barrages to disrupt Allied landing craft formations. Yet their limited manpower forced them to concentrate fire narrowly, leaving flanking edges vulnerable once assault groups adapted to shifting battlefield conditions. American officers at Omaha reorganized shattered platoons among the shingle, rallying survivors through improvised leadership that ignored initial objectives and prioritized localized breakthroughs. This flexible approach gradually undermined the static German defense, whose rigid command structure struggled to respond to unpredictable infiltration routes. Gaps opened along Omaha's bluffs when grenades and satchel charges neutralized isolated bunkers, severing interlocking fields of fire essential to German defensive doctrine. As communication trenches fell, remaining defenders fought independently, losing awareness of adjacent positions while American units pressed upward with increasing coordination. Naval gunfire shifted inland once spotters identified concentrations of resistance, delivering destructive salvos that shattered several key emplacements, hastening German disintegration. These precise bombardments compensated for early losses, providing the essential momentum needed to transform precarious footholds into viable advances. At Utah, American armored columns pushed inland toward causeways that determined whether reinforcements could exit the beach efficiently, overcoming disjointed German counterattacks executed without cohesive planning. Each failed attempt further weakened enemy morale, reducing their capacity to mount organized resistance across the sector. German battalions assigned to Omaha received contradictory orders through chaotic channels, creating delays that prevented coordinated counterattacks essential for repelling early breakthroughs. This paralysis allowed American forces to expand perimeter control, gradually linking isolated footholds into continuous front lines. Terrain at Omaha amplified confusion as smoke, debris, and shattered landmarks distorted German orientation, making coordinated firing solutions increasingly unreliable. Such disorientation enabled advancing infantry to close distances under diminishing resistance, ultimately tipping battlefield balance irreversibly. By late morning, both beaches demonstrated how scattered German defenses, hindered by disrupted communication and rigid doctrine, struggled against adaptive American tactics, solidifying the footholds that would eventually secure the liberation corridor into France. British forces landing at Gold Beach confronted fortified German positions embedded within coastal villages. Yet precise naval bombardments disrupted several strongpoints, enabling infantry to advance with measured coordination. As armored vehicles cleared beach obstacles, assault teams expanded lanes inland, steadily overwhelming defenders whose communication lines faltered under sustained pressure. The initial push at Gold exploited weakened German depth positions, where reserve units struggled to maneuver across cratered terrain created by intensive pre-landing artillery. British commanders capitalized on this disruption, directing infantry through narrow gaps that widened rapidly once resistance thinned, accelerating momentum toward crucial inland crossroads. At Juno Beach, Canadian troops faced destructive machine gun fire that swept across incoming landing craft, creating momentary disarray along the shoreline. Yet determined officers reorganized scattered companies, using smoke, terrain folds, and rapid infiltration to neutralize defensive clusters whose coordination diminished amid rising battlefield confusion. German units defending Juno were undermanned and reliant on outdated radio equipment, causing fragmented reports that failed to capture the scale of Canadian penetration. As armored reinforcements reached the beachhead, defenders were increasingly isolated, unable to counter the synchronized infantry tank advances pressing deep beyond their primary fortifications. Canadians pushed inward with disciplined aggression, reaching roadblocks that anchored German fallback lines, forcing defenders to disperse across the countryside. These breakthroughs disrupted expected engagement timelines, overwhelming command posts unprepared for rapid Allied progress that outpaced traditional German defensive planning. On Sword Beach, British assault forces encountered determined resistance from entrenched German machine gun nests, positioned to command the tidal flats, delaying early movements. However, engineers cleared obstacles under fire, enabling subsequent waves to land in greater strength, shifting numerical balance steadily toward the attackers. German formations around Sword attempted localized counterattacks, but fragmented leadership and congested roads hindered timely deployment of available reserves. British infantry exploited this hesitation, advancing through coastal suburbs with calculated precision, steadily dislodging defenders whose cohesion deteriorated as fighting intensified. Armored support at Sword arrived in organized intervals, allowing infantry to maintain pressure on retreating units, whose scattered engagements lacked a unified command. This combined arms coordination steadily eroded German capacity to regroup, turning localized skirmishes into extended withdrawals across multiple defensive layers. At Gold Beach, resistance collapsed further once British troops secured elevated ground overlooking vital inland routes, enabling observation posts to direct concentrated fire against remaining pockets. These advantageous positions accelerated German breakdown, preventing cohesive countermeasures during critical morning hours. Canadian forces at Juno linked with British troops pushing from Sword, creating a continuous front that eliminated gaps German commanders hoped to exploit. This unbroken Allied line disrupted enemy maneuver plans, sealing opportunities for delaying actions that might have stabilized the sector. By midday, pressure across all three eastern beaches fractured German operational rhythm, leaving commanders unable to impose structured defense. Allied advances multiplied across converging routes, overwhelming remaining resistance as strategic cohesion dissolved. Together, Gold, Juno, and Sword demonstrated how synchronized landings, adaptive leadership, and overwhelming combined arms strength shattered German expectations, establishing the eastern anchor of the Normandy invasion with decisive momentum. The 21st Panzer Division began its advance toward the invasion beaches under a veil of conflicting reports, creating early uncertainty that shaped its movements. As columns moved through the Norman countryside, commanders struggled to identify the main Allied thrust, slowing a response that demanded immediate clarity. When the division finally approached positions overlooking Sword Beach, British troops were still consolidating their early gains, offering a fleeting window for decisive intervention. Yet German officers hesitated, recognizing that fragmented intelligence concealed potential Allied armor concentrations lurking beyond visible ridgelines. The division's reconnaissance battalions attempted to probe forward, but sustained naval gunfire disrupted their efforts, forcing repeated withdrawals across exposed fields. These interruptions eroded the tempo of the advance, preventing a coordinated strike that might have threatened the expanding beachhead. Local commanders urged an immediate assault to break British cohesion, warning that delay would strengthen Allied footholds across the sector. Higher headquarters remained cautious, insisting on clearer situational awareness before committing the division to a full-scale engagement. As noon approached, the 21st Panzer Division launched a limited thrust that briefly penetrated between British and Canadian positions, creating concern within Allied command posts. However, the attack lacked sufficient mass, dispersing across open terrain vulnerable to naval artillery. Allied warships reacted with overwhelming firepower, saturating German approach routes with accurate shelling that disrupted vehicle formations. Tank crews were forced to maneuver erratically, losing time and cohesion as counterbattery bursts shook the advancing columns. The division's panzer grenadiers attempted to establish footholds near strategically placed farmsteads, but British infantry countered with coordinated small arms fire supported by mobile anti-tank guns. These defensive measures halted German infantry before they could threaten the beach logistics corridors. Communication breakdowns compounded the division's challenges, with radio interference delaying orders and leaving dispersed units unable to synchronize their efforts. Without unified action, scattered elements were pushed back gradually, unable to maintain pressure on the increasingly fortified Allied perimeter. By mid-afternoon, German officers recognized that naval dominance rendered further daylight attacks nearly impossible, prompting discussions over whether to withdraw toward more defensible ground. Concerns over ammunition shortages and rising casualties influenced these deliberations heavily. The order to disengage arrived as British armor began advancing inland, threatening to flank isolated German units still searching for viable positions. A controlled withdrawal became the only feasible option to preserve the division's remaining combat strength. During the retreat, surviving panzer elements regrouped behind secondary defensive lines, acknowledging that the critical moment for a decisive counterstroke had passed irrevocably. This realization marked a turning point in German assessments of the unfolding battle. The 21st Panzer Division's brief advance, uncertain hesitation, and eventual withdrawal demonstrated how disrupted communication, naval superiority, and fragmented leadership ensured that Germany's best opportunity to repel the landings slipped away during those crucial early hours. Germany's opportunity to repel the Allied invasion evaporated within the first 24 hours, as delays in command decisions allowed beachheads to consolidate with minimal interference. Field reports failed to reach senior leaders on time, creating confusion that paralyzed critical counteroffensive planning across Normandy's front lines. Rommel's absence from headquarters compounded the situation, leaving subordinate commanders uncertain whether to commit armored reserves or await orders from Berlin. The absence of decisive direction meant that divisions capable of mounting a counterattack remained largely static, surrendering the initiative to the advancing Allied forces who exploited every delay. Communication failures between Corps' headquarters and frontline units magnified hesitation, as conflicting intelligence reports suggested multiple potential landing sites. German officers spent hours debating the scale and location of the threat, missing the narrow window in which an aggressive, coordinated strike might have disrupted the amphibious assault. The armored divisions, including the 21st and 12th Panzer, experienced repeated pauses while waiting for authorization from Rundstedt and Keitel. Each moment of indecision allowed the Allies to reinforce critical sectors, transport heavy equipment inland, and establish artillery positions that would blunt any eventual German response. Rommel had anticipated that the beaches had to be seized or destroyed within hours, but his absence and the rigid command structure prevented rapid execution. Orders trickled down too slowly, forcing units to react rather than act proactively against the invasion forces spreading across Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. By late afternoon on June 6, armored units finally approached the front, but Allied naval and air superiority disrupted their coordination. German tanks and mechanized infantry were isolated in small pockets, vulnerable to concentrated Allied fire and unable to achieve the mass necessary to repel the entrenched forces. Field intelligence underestimated the speed and scale of the Allied landings, misidentifying the most critical sectors. This misjudgment created misallocated reserves, with powerful formations held back at locations that no longer influenced the main action, further widening the temporal gap Germany needed to strike decisively. Even when commanders realized the severity of the threat, efforts to mobilize counterattacks were delayed by internal rivalries and fear of acting without explicit orders. The entrenched hierarchy prevented initiative at lower levels, a rigidity that contrasted sharply with the Allies' flexible, adaptive command structure. Rommel's return to headquarters came too late to influence outcomes meaningfully, as the Allied beachheads had grown beyond the possibility of containment. Coordination between Luftwaffe, artillery, and armored units was impossible under the pressure of expanding front lines, leaving only isolated engagements instead of a cohesive defensive action. The German failure within the first 24 hours underscored how command indecision, communication breakdowns, and over-reliance on centralized authorization rendered even the most experienced forces ineffective against a well-planned, rapid invasion. Every hour lost diminished the likelihood of success, turning opportunity into irrevocable defeat. By sunset on June 6, Allied forces had secured critical footholds, enabling continuous reinforcements and logistical support. The decisive first day had closed Germany's narrow window to prevent the invasion from succeeding, demonstrating that timing and responsiveness were as lethal as firepower in modern warfare. The inability to act decisively in the 24-hour window forever altered the trajectory of World War II, showing that even highly skilled military leaders like Rommel could be thwarted by structural inflexibility and delayed decision-making at the highest levels of command. Rommel returned to La Roche-Guyon after sunset on June 6, facing a battlefield that had already slipped beyond German control, as Allied forces solidified their positions along multiple beaches with relentless efficiency and coordinated support. His absence had left a vacuum of decisive leadership at the critical moment. The Atlantic Wall, despite months of meticulous fortification, had failed to stop the landings, and Rommel immediately realized that his calculations had underestimated the Allied ability to adapt to terrain, tides, and obstacles. The barriers that should have slowed the attackers were now largely bypassed or destroyed. German commanders reported sporadically, as communication lines had been severed or overwhelmed, leaving Rommel to piece together a chaotic picture of fragmented units and confused defensive lines across Normandy's coast. Every message suggested delay, miscommunication, or misallocation of armored divisions critical to any counteroffensive. Allied naval gunfire and air superiority ensured that reinforcements and supplies continued to flow onto the beaches, making German positions increasingly untenable. Rommel observed that despite local bravery, German troops lacked cohesion and direction, rendering counterattacks ineffective against a rapidly consolidating enemy force. The 21st Panzer Division had engaged in brief skirmishes but was withdrawn prematurely due to orders misinterpreted in Berlin, leaving the defense of key sectors exposed. Rommel's frustration grew as he realized that the initiative, which could have been seized within hours, was irretrievably lost. Reports of paratrooper landings inland demonstrated that the Allies had already disrupted German communication and logistics networks, further limiting the effectiveness of armored and infantry reinforcements. Rommel noted that the initial panic and confusion had irreversibly shaped the operational environment, leaving German forces reacting instead of dictating. Rommel's personal presence could not reverse systemic delays caused by Rundstedt, Keitel, and other high-ranking officers whose rigid adherence to protocol slowed decision-making. The window for decisive action, which he had identified before leaving headquarters, had already closed, leaving only piecemeal resistance scattered along the coast. By nightfall, the Allied footholds were firmly established, supply lines functional, and command coordination increasingly effective. Rommel recognized that the larger strategic consequence of the landings was inevitable, as Germany's ability to mount a rapid counterattack had been fatally undermined by time-sensitive indecision. Observing the aftermath, Rommel contemplated the failure not as a result of individual incompetence, but as a structural problem, where centralized authority and poor communication hindered rapid battlefield adaptation, highlighting the contrast between German rigidity and Allied operational flexibility that ensured success. Despite the collapse, Rommel directed remaining units to fortify secondary positions and resist further inland advancement, demonstrating leadership under pressure, yet fully aware that the larger Normandy campaign had slipped irreversibly from German control, and the Wehrmacht had lost the initiative that might have preserved the front. Rommel's return underscored a bitter reality. Even brilliant strategy and preparation are insufficient when decisive action is delayed. An opportunity is missed, as the Allies' invasion became a testament to timing, adaptability, and relentless execution on the part of the attackers. The events of June 6th, from sunset onward, cemented the invasion's success and foreshadowed the eventual liberation of Western Europe. Rommel, witnessing the battlefield he had attempted to command from afar, understood that the war's momentum had shifted irrevocably, marking the beginning of Germany's strategic decline.